Hello, and welcome to the Aquarist Podcast, your source for interviews with people from all across the tropical fish keeping hobby. I'm your host, Randy Reed. Please subscribe and check out all previous episodes on Podbean, Stitcher, Google Play, iTunes, or aquarispodcast.com. You can also check out additional content by following the Aquarist Podcast Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter accounts. If you like what you hear, please rate and leave a review for the show. Enjoy the interview. Today's date is Monday, August 6th, 2018. My guest today is Jim Cumming. Jim is a cichlid fanatic and has been a longtime member of the Aquarium Society of Winnipeg and has served as the club's president for 8 years. Jim has made countless presentations at fish clubs and conventions and served as a forum moderator for several online fish forums. I'm thrilled to have Jim on the show today. So Jim, welcome to the Aquarist Podcast.
Thank you, Randy. It's really my pleasure. Always nice to talk fish with fish people.
Yeah, definitely, and I know people love hearing just a couple people nerding out on a fish topic. So I'm glad to have you on, and hopefully, I'm sure it will. A lot of your wisdom and just experience in the hobby that you'll be able to share with us, and especially as we eventually dive into the cichlids of Madagascar. So to start it off, Jim, what is your origin story? How did you get started in this fish keeping hobby?
Well, let me put it this way: I've been keeping fish on and off, mostly on, for 65 years. When I was 8 years old, I caught wind of the fact that somebody down the street was selling platies. And so I got my 1-gallon pickle jar with some Hartz Mountain bird gravel and a sprig of kabamba, and then went off to get my one fish, which happened to be a gravid female red wag platy. That night, she had some young, and from that point on, I was hooked. I was 8 years old at the time, and I've never looked back.
Oh, that is fantastic. What did your parents think? Did you sneak this into the house, or was it approved by them?
Well, I always had a leaning toward living things, even though my university training and so on all dealt with physical sciences. Biologically speaking, I was very much into it from a young age. So frogs and tadpoles and any other kind of reptile or amphibian would make its presence felt in my household. So the fish were no surprise to my parents, and they encouraged it, actually.
And just for context, was that also in Winnipeg?
Yes, it was. I was born in Winnipeg and raised in Winnipeg, and I've been here all my life, yes.
Oh, excellent. And so I guess if you could kind of shed some light and some details. So you started with the 1 gallon with the platy that was gravid. Did you know it was gravid at the time?
Well, no, not really. But when I saw 2 little ones up in the kabamba sprig, like little miniatures of the parents, I quickly learned that this is what it's all about. The idea of fish breeding and the fascination associated with that, and I've never looked back. I got a 5-gallon aquarium shortly thereafter with a bunch of guppies, and I remember I couldn't afford a heater, so I put it over the hot air vent from our furnace to keep it warm. And one morning, just as I was going to school, I noticed a bunch of young ones in the tank, and again, it just, it had an impact on me. So I guess I have never looked back in that regard. My first cichlids, I picked a pair of 1-inch long Mesanota, which at the time were just simply called Cyclosoma festivums, from a basement shop. It turned out that these 1-inch fish ended up to be a beautiful pair. I had them for about 5 or 6 years, enjoyed them entirely, and I think that planted the seed for the cichlids, that's for sure.
And at what age were you when you got these cichlids?
I think I was about 12 when I got the Mesanota. And then my dad, I guess he sensed that I was quite interested in this, so he helped me build a fish room, so to speak. So by the time I was 15 or 16, I actually had a bit of a fish room down the basement, and my dad got into it too. We'd go out Saturday mornings, and we'd look over the different shops and what was in there, and it was great to have my dad's support on that. And he was with that for a good number of years until I eventually left home.
That's so cool that you kind of got your dad into the hobby as opposed to your dad getting you into the hobby.
Yeah, it worked that way. It worked in reverse, but it was a great inspiration. The father-son bonding thing. We certainly bonded a lot over fish and also records. He was a major record collector, country and western mainly. I was more rock and roll in my teens, and we used to go out on Saturday mornings and look at places that emptied jukeboxes out, and we go through the jukebox records and bring them home. And so we had a couple of neat things going on between son and father. Mm-hmm.
That's very admirable, and I really hope that with my son, who's 20-ish, 21 months right now, I really hope that he and I can have that kind of relationship as he gets older. Maybe there's a hobby or two he can get me involved in. I do want to take a step back and say that's just one more tally of somebody getting their start in the hobby or somebody really falling in love when a live bear gives birth. So it's almost like, I don't know, 3/4 of the people that I've interviewed for this podcast have all pointed to some early event in their life where it's like a live bear, whether it's a guppy, a molly, or a platy, giving birth, and that just instantly hooking them at a very, very young age.
Yes, it's like a little miracle happening, all at once. And I guess young people, kids, aren't necessarily expecting to see something like that, but when I saw it, a whole bunch of different ideas went through my head, like, what is going on here? Wow, is that really happening? It has impact, there's no doubt.
So, Jim, I'm very curious about the shops in Winnipeg at the time of your youth. So you mentioned a basement shop where you got your Cichlids. If you wouldn't mind kind of, maybe just expounding on what the shops were like when you were a kid and maybe now how they have changed into, more of your local shops, or I guess just what you've seen change in the retail locations.
Well, back in the earliest of days, there were probably 3 or 4 shops only. I can't say that I visited them all. There was one that we used to visit called the Reliable Bird Company, and they always had fish in there and a variety of other things. They seemed to be the main one in town. This is back in the mid-'50s. But the basement shops were simply young people who had an interest in the hobby, and they would breed a fish, and they'd advertise it in the paper, and you'd simply phone them and say, "I'd like to see what you got," and you'd go over and pick a couple of fish up. So when I picked up the Mesonoda, for example, the young fellow, he was probably no more than 17 or 18 himself, and he had angelfish in a tank with a piece of newspaper over the front and a small hole cut out. There were some angelfish parents tending eggs. And then he had this tank of Mesonoda, and it just, again, magical. I remember his tank of tiger barbs, a huge tank of tiger barbs. It was probably a 20-gallon tank, but to a little guy it was huge. And I remember that vision of all of these striped fish with orange fins swimming in schools, and I thought, this is fantastic. And again, everything has impact when you're young, for sure.
That is so cool. So when you're opening up your newspaper and you're looking at the classified section, was it a fairly regular occurrence that you would see somebody's ad like, "Hey, I've got these cichlids," or "I've got angelfish for sale, here's my phone number," or was it hit or miss?
Yeah, there was a little section called Livestock and Pets, and invariably you'd find, on a given day, maybe Saturday more busy, 2 or 3 ads from just ordinary individuals that had fish in there, selling fish. Simply that. It's much like the online stuff right now, like Kijiji we have here, and you can go to the pets and accessories and homing fish and that type of thing. Similar, very similar to that. But in terms of major shops, there were only a couple that I visited. I had limited mobility when I was young. It was strictly up to my dad where we went, and we had a couple of favorites. The mom-and-pop shops, they did quite well in the 70s and 80s, and then when the bigger chains came along, like Petland and so on, many of them, the smaller places, folded. But in town right now, we have 3 or 4 fairly good-sized, I guess quite successful shops on the go. And we have a wholesaler in town as well. I don't know if you've heard of him, but his name is Spencer Jack, and he runs a place called Aficionados, and he supplies fish all across Canada. And it's very fortunate for me to have him in this town because due to his is importing fish, I get access to quite a few things that I normally wouldn't get in a normal pet store. So that's really helped expand my hobby too. But I would say that at this stage in the game for me, I'm far enough into it that I just really can't get anything of particular use or supply for my hobby. I've got to order things in, and I usually order most of my things from the States. And there's a parcel service. I'm only 60 miles north of the American border, so I usually just ship them to a parcel service at the border and then pick them up down there. That helps me offset some rather major costs. There are bargains to be had if you look in the right places, I guess.
Oh, gotcha. So I guess now let's kind of understand, how did you go from, all right, so you've got your fish room, you're in your teens, to Jim Cumming now, who is a member of CARES. You've been a fish club president. I guess, what did that evolution for you? How did that go, and how did you become kind of this prominent figure in the hobby, where you've spoken at countless fish clubs, probably countless conventions as well?
Well, that's a very good question. I wish there was an easy path for me to describe. I was in fish for 20, 30 years before any sort of external notoriety of me occurred, I suppose you could say. I would go to the ACA conventions in the early 80s, a number of them, meet people, get my name out there a little bit, but, I was that Canadian that nobody knew much about. I would, in the early 2000s, I was on several forums, and I would put my postings out there. I wanted to share my fish with anybody who would care to look at them, not to boost my ego, but to simply say, hey, look, this is what I've got. It's got some really interesting things going on here. What do you think? That was my main mandate. And I guess when the social media became more prominent, and I realized that most of the forums were very, very slow to develop. When you put something on, you might get a few responses, but nobody was really looking that much. And when I finally made a commitment to Facebook, and I think that's what turned things around. When you put things on Facebook, you get immediate recognition of things out there. Sure, in a few days they're gone into obscurity, but in the meantime, people are getting a sense of this guy up in Canada who's reading a lot of fish and showing videos and pictures and seems to know what he's talking about, which is the great myth, perhaps. I don't know. But it turns out that just through exposure, people then get curious about you, and they friend you. I have a YouTube channel that also is a major help in getting me out there. I presently have over 650 videos on my YouTube channel right now, and they're all of my fish. I'm extremely interested in the breeding, the social aspects of fish keeping, interactions between within a given species and external to that, species to species. So my YouTube channel helps too, and if anybody ever wants to find out anything, I can always draw their attention to perhaps a YouTube video or two that I have there for them. So good news travels. I think it's good news. I've always been wanting to share my fish with people, and I guess that the Madagascar cichlids gave me that first major opportunity to do that, because they were so different and people knew so little about them that the curiosity factor kicked in, I think.
Yeah, I should have actually. I'm sorry. As I was framing that initial question to you, Jim, I realized that was going to it was going to put you in an awkward spot, and I guess I could have just summarized and said, "All right, Jim, tell me about when you became awesome and popular."
Oh, okay. Well, you use those words. I guess, like I say, I have a certain amount of notoriety out there, and I like to keep perpetuating that myth. But I'm not an expert by any means. I'm on the learning curve, like everybody else in fish keeping. You'd think that after being in the hobby for over 60 years, that there wouldn't be much more to know. Unfortunately, or fortunately, whichever way you look at it, that's not true. there's always lots of room to learn. And I have my setbacks now with new things going on in my fish room. And the problem solving is stimulating. It really is. It's, you begin to think, well, what's going to happen in my hobby that would kind of recharge my batteries or get me fired up about something again? Well, Madagascar cichlids have done that. And I know what dire straits they're in nature, and I know Madagascar as a country is reeling from issues of difficulty. And when you keep fish and you limit it to just the fish, you're kind of doing yourself a disservice, because you really have to dig into where they are and what the conditions are like where they are living naturally. And this is what I've tended to become more and more attuned to, the Madagascar as a country and what's making all of these terrible ecological disasters take place. So when I do my presentation on Madagascar cichlids, it's almost like the good, the bad, and the ugly type of thing, where it's a magnificent wonderland of ecological uniqueness, but it's being degraded so greatly by the human component, and the offshoot of that is extinction and endangerment for every living thing on that island. So you do get quite emotionally connected to it all. It's not just, I keep these fish and this is how you deal with them. It's more than that. It's really an emotional connection to the whole of Madagascar and its issues now.
Yeah, and so I think when when fish keepers, even if you're not a cichlid person, when you think of Africa, you immediately go to the Rift Lakes. You'll think of those cichlids there. If you think Madagascar, even as a fish keeper, maybe your mind just kind of wanders to the silly cartoons of lemurs and all of that kind of pop culture that is around the island of Madagascar. But I don't think, unless you're really ingrained in the cichlid hobby, you don't really know much about the Madagascar cichlids, or you don't hear much about it. At least that's from my personal experience. So I guess to kind of, piggyback off of the presentation that you already do, I guess kind of help me understand, or help us understand rather, what in particular is going on in Madagascar, the species that are there, kind of the plight facing them, maybe a little species overview of what we're actually finding that's endemic to the island, and I'll just let you kind of run with it, Jim.
Okay, well, Madagascar was once attached to East Africa. And in fact, probably no more than 500 miles or so from the Rift Lakes, maybe 500 to 1,000 miles from the Rift Lakes. Through continental drift, Madagascar broke free of mainland Africa and stayed connected with India for some length of time, where there was some crossover of speciation between Madagascar and India. But Madagascar basically became isolated about 60 million years ago, and everything that is developed on that island has been in complete isolation. The evolution that normally occurs with diversity, change in physical setting, just didn't occur there. There's a belief that a lot of the animal forms that live there are basically unchanged and have been unchanged for millions of years. We talk about Lake Malawi, the Rift Lakes, the fact that in that one lake there can be hundreds of species, simply because a species, through separation from others, tends to diverge. And each bay has its own unique species. If they move out into deep water, they get predated on by the deep water haps. And so therefore they stay put and they develop their own unique speciation. Well, Madagascar is kind of the reverse of that. Instead of having one body of water with bays that are isolated, it's an island that has countless river systems that never intersect. So when the fish do have a presence in a particular river system or a lake, there is no possibility for that fish to move to another river or lake. So therefore it develops along its own lines, and has been for hundreds of years, thousands of years, millions of years, in fact. So there's no reason to change. If the conditions are basically unchanging, then the fish themselves have no reason to evolve to a new setting of physical properties. and the fish tend to stay pretty much the same. But they do diverge through natural evolution, and therefore you get a lot of different populations of similar-looking fish, but they are believed to be different species. That's the case right now. Yes, fish don't simply go from one place to another because of overland flooding or some such thing like that. They tend to stay put.
So do you tend to see, and I'm sorry for cutting you off, do you tend to see then the cichlids of Madagascar, are they fairly, and I hate to use this word, but are they fairly vanilla in terms of their behavior, whereas in the Great Rift Lakes, you see because of competition and just because of the varying food sources, how they have diversified for survival. Do you see that same kind of thing happening in the Madagascar cichlids, or are they more, like I said, more vanilla in terms of their behavior?
Well, in their natural setting, most of the Madagascar cichlids don't have any natural predators, and therefore they don't have to develop defensive mechanisms or particular strategies to look after their young or raise their young. There's simply no threats there. Now, in recent years, with the introduction of invasives, tilapia, snakeheads, gambusia, the situation's changed. The fish haven't been able to adapt to protect their young or eggs from these predators, and so basically they are helpless regarding possible predation on their fry and so on. So they're a very different sort of fish. In an aquarium, they have a certain behavior defensively against predation in the tank, but it almost seems as if they're not programmed to carry that through consistently. They are very, how shall I say, easily stressed. They're very easily distracted. If you approach a tank with a pair that have eggs and you come to the aquarium, they'll think that they're going to be fed, and they simply leave their eggs. They don't have a sense of needing to stick by them. If other fish are in the tank, they can move in and predate on those eggs or young. So it is a bit different. They're very good parents when they're allowed to be, and in this case, in a public aquarium, public meaning just in your home where there's movement, activity outside the tank, they can be very easily distracted. So there are different strategies you can use to kind of help them along in that regard. But in nature, that's the problem. Now, the main issue, I guess, with and I'm talking mainly about the Paratroplus here. The Paratilapia and the Tychochromis are much more like Central American cichlids. They can successfully raise their young. They do have defensive mechanisms that are very similar to the New World cichlids, but it's the Paratroplus that don't. And so they are very prone to eating their eggs, simply not getting them to the free swimming stage. It's quite a challenge to get them there. In nature, then, it's the presence of these invasives and the fact that they're being overfished, and there is pollution in their water sources that are bringing them to the edge of extinction. So yes, they're quite different from the usual cichlid, if there is such a thing as the usual cichlid.
Wow. So I guess thinking now to your efforts with these fish, how many Madagascar cichlids do you have? And if it's not, an overly large number, I mean, I guess kind of help us understand which of those species and which of those genuses do you currently have in your fish room?
Yeah, there are only a certain number that are available in the hobby. Exports from Madagascar just don't take place unless it's maybe for scientific reasons. Maybe a zoo or a scientific facility might be able to get them out. But for the most part, the number of species that exist are the same now as were available in the mid-90s. There were two gentlemen that were from Europe that were instrumental in bringing these fish into the hobby at all. That's Jean-Claude Nourissat, who was a doctor in France, and a gentleman named Patrick Derame, who was a Swiss national. And they made countless expeditions in the early and mid-90s into Madagascar and brought out fish to southern Europe. And from there, they were distributed throughout Europe and some actually to North America. Leif de Mason, who owns Old World Exotic Fish in Homestead, Florida, made a commitment to turn part of his fish farming operation over to Madagascar cichlids. So in terms of North American distribution, it's through Leif's efforts and his facility that has made some of these available to the hobbyist over here. The number of species I have, I don't have them all the time, but I had 3 different populations of Paratilapia pollini. There was one called East Coast Pony, another called Marilambo, and then the one that was thought to be pollini, but perhaps is not, is the species Andapa, the large spot pollini. There is a fish being distributed called bleaker-eye, but unfortunately that's not a reality. Apparently bleaker-eye did exist at one time in Madagascar, but before it was exported, it went extinct. The term bleaker-eye was synonymous with the large spot form, and the pollini was considered to be the small spot form. But now it's known that different populations have different spot sizes, and there is no such thing as a small spot, large spot. They're simply all pollini, but with a variety of different spot sizes and colorations based upon population and location. So 3 of the Paratilapia. The Tychichromines, relatively few of those available. One is called the Grandadiri East Coast Gold. Another is the Oligocanthus, which comes from the northern part of Madagascar. Some of them actually are on islands, volcanic islands, called Nosy Bay. The Oligocanthus has different populations as well, different appearances. Some have redder fins, some not. Some have a blacker body, some not. And then there's one that has been introduced relatively recently, probably about 6 or 7 years ago. It made its appearance. It was called Tychochromis species Taransi, and in the last year or 2 it was given finally species designation, and it's now called Tychochromis mainti. And it looks very much like Grandadiri. The Toronto Zoo have some in quarantine. They have Tychochromis enceladus, which was the one that was thought to have become extinct. It was extinct in the hobby for sure, but they have a breeding program going. And they also have Tychochromis loiselli there. But they're not in the hobby. They haven't been distributed here yet. Some have been sent to a zoo in the Netherlands. I was talking to a fellow named Peter Peterson there, who's the curator, and he has some young enceladus right now, and hopefully he will be able to raise those and distribute them. The Paratroplus are definitely the ones that capture people's attention. If you want to think of an iconic Madagascan cichlid, you would think of these fish that look very much like saltwater tangs. They have a beautiful compressed body, small mouths, forked tails. They do look like the epitome of a saltwater tang, but yet strictly a freshwater fish. Now I have Paratroplus menarambo, maculatus, dambabi, nurasadi, kainari. These are the only ones that are generally available in the hobby right now. Oh, and pardon me, let's see, there's another one I think I have. I should know this. I think I have the 5 of them right now, and I have young from 4 of the 5 at this present time. I've bred them several times. Last year I had nurasadi available, and I shipped some to Poland in Europe, and it was an interesting thing because they had not had any opportunity to get Paratroplus nurasadi over there, but yet I had them here, so they went to Poland then. So I have then the 5 Paratroplus, 3 of the Tychochromis, and 3 of the Paratilapia. And that's about where it ends.
Do we have any estimate of what % of these cichlids in Madagascar have already gone extinct, or maybe what scientists feel was the number of different cichlid genuses, genus and species that were endemic at one time, and how many have gone extinct and how many are endangered? Just kind of rough numbers.
Yes, this is This has been determined through the. I'm just trying to find something here for you. I can give you that information if you have a moment.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay.
This is a free show for the listeners, so they don't get to complain.
Okay. Yeah, I know I don't have all this information available all the time, but I'm getting there. Okay. The IUCN, the International Union for Concerned Nations, Red List assessment of Madagascar's freshwater fishes. Right now, there's 28% of them are data deficient, meaning that they don't know anything about them, really. They can't even make a comment on how they're doing. They don't know much about their distribution and numbers because Madagascar is so difficult to get around. There's no real road system, and it takes incredible time, effort, and money to get anywhere on that island. So 28% are data deficient. 12% have been considered to be of least concern, meaning that they're there in sufficient numbers and a large enough different locations that they're okay. 2% are considered non-threatened, only because they're in such remote areas that there's no human threat to them. Vulnerable, 29%. They're considered to be fish that if no steps are taken toward trying to improve their lot, 29, almost a third of the fish there are in the vulnerable state. 13% are considered endangered, meaning that within 10 years, if nothing is done, they'll probably be on the verge of extinction. 12% are critically endangered. If nothing is done much, again, to further their cause, within 5 years, some of those could be extinct. 1% is considered extinct in the wild. Actually, the Menarambo was considered to be extinct in 1996, and then they found a small relic population in a nearby lake, but it took them 10 years to find that, and the lake was only like 10 miles away. So it just shows you how difficult it is to get around in that country and to assess what's going on. 3% of the fish, since they've been keeping records, have been considered to have gone extinct. So that's the way it is then. 28% they don't know anything about, 12% are okay, 2% are near threatened, 29% vulnerable, 13% endangered, 12% critically endangered, with a small percentage like basically extinct or certainly thought to be extinct. So that's the story on that.
Yeah, so those aren't very awesome numbers, I guess. Like
they're not encouraging numbers. In fact, if it were only the fish, that would be one thing. But there isn't a creature on that island that isn't threatened this way. In fact, they say that unless there's an attempt to curb hunting for lemur, because they hunt them as bushmeat there. I mean, the people need protein to eat, and they'll hunt the lemur. The lemur would not last more than 10 more years on that island unless special measures are taken to protect them. So it's sad all the way along. There's countless species that are found nowhere else on Earth, and they are all on the verge of extinction. Yeah.
For the fish, are there any targeted conservation efforts? I mean, outside of the CARES organization promoting the keeping and breeding of these fish in captivity, but is there anything actually like boots on the ground happening in Madagascar to help out? Is there anything like a Project Piaba or anything like that to help this situation?
Yes, there are. Actually, about 8 or 9 years ago, a Madagascan national named Guy Tampiok was commissioned to try to save certain species and put them back into the environment. He has an area near Andapa where he has ponds dug. I guess the water table is high enough that the ponds are filled naturally. And he is breeding a lot of the fish that are on the verge of extinction or highly endangered, and breeding them in some numbers. Now, he's being funded by the Toronto Zoo and special grants to keep this going. He's also breeding fish as a source of food for the people. Paratilapia, for example, are considered to be a desirable food fish there, and he has ponds devoted to that as well. There is this active attempt to try to get something going right on the ground there in terms of this breeding program. Now, there's also another program that has been going on since 1971 in a city called Ramsar in Iran. An international conference was held to try to designate areas of ecological importance. And what they do is they choose areas that need protection, and they try to get the government on board with that protection. Actually, right now, Madagascar has about 30 of these designated Ramsar sites, and they are being protected, and there's no fishing allowed in them as far as they can regulate it, and no exporting, no removal of fish or any other creatures from those areas. Now, most of them are along the marine coast, so a lot of them are the saltwater fish areas, protected reef areas, and so on. But there is a movement afoot toward more of the freshwater sites being included in these Ramsar sites. So there are attempts, but it's, I think, like a drop in the bucket. When you have a population that is desperate for food, shelter, the extreme amount of erosion that occurs in that country is strictly due to the fact that the people strip it bare of any wood, simply to burn, to create charcoal for burning fires, and the erosion results in turbidity of the waters to such an extent that the fish can't survive in there. So unless the needs of the people are better looked after, I don't know if these measures of designating sites or trying to put fish back into these areas that are at risk is going to do much if nothing is going to change in the environment.
Yeah, because like you're saying, it's not a matter of just overfishing and leaving the natural habitat alone. It's overfishing, it's deforestation, it's erosion. So even if we're able to captive breed, the prospects of reintroduction into those original collection points or origination points is looking slim to none. Yeah. Exactly,
that's the problem. It's one of the poorest countries in the world. If you talk about third world countries, it's below third world. And it's such a desperate situation there. The government is not able to make things better. They don't have the control of the country that way. I've heard that people that visit there see nothing but abject poverty, out of control theft. If things aren't literally nailed down, they'll be stolen just because the people need those things. It's a sad situation, and it shows itself in all of the ecology of the country. Yeah.
Yeah, that is very, very unfortunate. And so I guess to kind of bring it back to, if somebody, whether they're CARES inspired or just inspired from this conversation, if they could dedicate maybe a tank or two to one or two species that are readily available in the hobby, which would you point them to from more of a conservation standpoint of, all right, if you're going to keep one of these Madagascars, I would probably point you to, this one or that one because there's not as many people keeping this particular species in captivity?
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know if they're for everybody. That's the thing. Most of them do get quite large. Most of the Paratroplus get to be a good 10 to 12 inches long total length. There are a couple of smaller species, 5-6 inches, but one of them, the Neurosati, can be quite aggressive, and unless you have it in a large enough tank with large enough numbers, they can be quite hard on one another. I would say that the best starting Madagascar cichlid would be something in the Paratilapia or Tychochromis area, because they're more like Central American cichlids in many respects, and people would find less difficulty in keeping them, and maybe having to transition to the Paratroplus might be a bit extreme. However, having said that, if a person has a good-sized tank, 120, 150, 180 gallon, keeping a colony of, say, 6 to 10 of a given species in there is a magnificent sight. Unless people are actually, only intent on breeding those fish, there is nothing more spectacular than seeing a group of these fish together in a tank like that, a big tank. And they're a magnificent showpiece fish. They really are. Aggression, not really to worry about if they're there in a school. Put 2 fish in a tank of any type, and they're going to be at one another. But you put 6 to 8 to 10 in there, and you've got this beautiful, copacetic situation where there isn't a split fin or a scale missing. The fish are simply in unison. It's a beautiful sight. I would say that the one that would be most available would be the Paratroplus menarambo, the pinstripe gamba. That would be the one that I would say most people would say, oh yeah, I've seen that fish, or I've seen pictures of that fish. Although my interest doesn't hone in on any particular fish. I'm still looking to try to increase my number of species, and I'm just hopeful that in the next few months I can come by another species that I don't have and haven't had all sorts of difficulty trying to get over the years. And this fall, hopefully I'll be able to get some. You just did a podcast with Jose Gonzalez from San Antonio. And he is, I don't want to call him my mentor, but he is the person that I've turned to in many respects to get some of my fish from. And we bounce ideas off of one another. And he has a fish called Paratroplus damii right now that he has just bred a few times now, and I'm hopeful I can get some young from him. If this podcast were to last 2 more hours, I would tell you the whole story of my attempts to get damii from Europe, which I can't go through it again. I'll start crying, I'm sure.
Oh no! Well, you know what? This is
it was a very tough story.
There's always future episodes, Jim. We could have you back on and share. We could just call it the search for a certain species, and just kind of let you run at it again.
Well, that's right. I'm speaking at this year's 2019 ACA convention, and the theme of that whole convention is the Holy Grail fish. And I have a video on there which talks about my attempts to get the damii and the fact that at the time the video was made, I still hadn't had it. And I found out that I will not be able to get it from Europe. So anyway, I've got hope that later in the fall, perhaps Jose will have some young available, and I'll be okay on that.
Well, that's excellent, Jim. I mean, thank you very much for all of that, insight and content and information, and just a very in-depth understanding of what's happening in Madagascar, and some species deep dives on these Madagascar cichlids. And I guess we kind of had a little segue there. I'm very curious to know what does the future look like for Jim Cumming? Maybe some speaking events that you have scheduled. I know you just mentioned ACA 2019. If there's anything else on the docket, I mean, feel free to let us know. Listeners are all around the country, people in Canada, a couple different countries are pretty prominent listeners of this podcast. So if anybody's like, man, this Canadian guy sounds super awesome. He's very kind.
I've had a wonderful time spreading the word on these fish, and I always used to say it's all about the fish, right? I mean, this is what I was all about. I had to talk about the fish, my fish, or anybody who would care to listen. And now I've modified that to it's all about the fish and fish people, because I've met so many darn nice people out there in my travels that it's blown me away. I mean, it's not that I didn't know they weren't there in the first place, but everybody is so receptive to wanting to hear about these things, and the receptions have been great. This past year, I have had 13 or 14 different speaking engagements. Last fall, I was in Sacramento. You mentioned that you were originally from Sacramento or in that area, and so I was fortunate to give a double talk, one to the San Francisco Club and to Sacramento. Stayed with Rich Byerly, one of the club president in Sacramento right now. But as of this year, I've been to Washington, D.C., to Detroit and Grand Rapids, the NEC convention in Connecticut. I've been to Edmonton twice. I went to Berlin, Germany, and Dresden, Germany in April. I was in Cincinnati at the end of June. I've got coming up Rogers, Arkansas, the Columbus area fish enthusiasts, Minnesota Aquarium Society, and in November I'm in Brisbane, Australia. And next year I've got a couple of commitments. One is York, Pennsylvania, and Louisville, Kentucky, and I'm also going to Stockholm, Sweden in March as well. And then I'm at the ACA convention in Connecticut. But things are starting to happen. I guess clubs are getting their speaking programs together for the coming year. And I never say no. I really don't. If anybody asks me, unless it's a conflict of dates, I'm always willing to go out and talk to the people about them. And I don't just have Madagascar presentations. I've actually got about 6 or 7 different presentations that I do now. Some are in more complete stages of others. I've got one on the South American cichlids, which is a big thing in my hobby. Probably half of what I have in my fish room is South American. So I call that South American cichlids the Magnificents. I have the Indian cichlids. There are 3 of them. So my presentation is the cichlids of India and Indian biotopes. And then one of the ones that I'm giving at the ACA convention is the combined Madagascar and Indian cichlids, since they have a connection through tectonic plate movement and continental drift. I've also got a pond which I've been up and running for 12 years, but I don't put anything in it but tropical fish. Right now I've got Central American and South American cichlids in my yard pond, and I have a presentation on strategies for maintaining tropical fish in northern ponds. I am north of the 49th parallel. So
I was just going to say, you're almost in like frozen tundra country come wintertime.
It's not far off that. Yeah, thank you. Yes, don't remind me, please. I'm continually checking the temperature nightly. Here it is the middle of August, and I'm already looking at temperatures for the evening, and if it weren't for my immersion heater and other heat retention strategies, I think my fish would be brought in by the end of this month, but they'll be out there to the middle of October.
Well, Jim, I'm going to have to book about another 10 hours of your time across various different dates to kind of break down and just have you go through each of those, things that you had brought up. So I mean, if you ever need anybody to help, be your PowerPoint assistant, I'm happy to tag along for the Australia trip, as well as I think you said Switzerland. So I'm fantastic when it comes to actually clicking the mouse button when you say next slide. So that's one of the top things.
I need good technical help. I really do.
That's what they taught me in grad school. So that's my area of focus. So Jim, thank you very much for coming on. I mean, this is super insightful. I hope everybody comes away from this with a little bit more of an appreciation for the cichlids of Madagascar, or just a foundational knowledge of hey, I didn't know that there were cichlids in Madagascar, and they have a little bit more of an appreciation and understanding of what's going on. And maybe somebody, if they're feeling, up to the challenge, maybe they look into one of these Madagascar cichlids and learn from you. And we'll definitely make sure that we have links to your YouTube channel. I don't think you're doing any of those trendy videos where you're dancing outside of a moving car to some, popular song. But
not yet. Not yet. Maybe that might be coming.
Not
Actually, I just want to say one thing. I think that the dimension of fish keeping is enhanced so much by not only getting a fish, but then working backwards and try to find out where it came from, of what it's doing in its natural habitat, to work it backward to the country. Because if you can connect the fish to the country, a real physical place, it just adds this whole incredible new dimension to fish keeping. And not to mention the fact that if you get a fish, you have to learn the scientific name. That is a must.
A few episodes back, I challenged myself, and I ran through when I was doing kind of my overview of the tanks that I kept. I challenged myself. I looked at the scientific names, and I've been very diligent about making sure that if at least it's something that I keep, to your point, I know the scientific names and I can pronounce them. And then if there are any that I'm interested in that I just can't pronounce it, then I just have to pass on that species.
Well, as they say, there are no more ancient Greeks around to challenge you on pronunciation. So however you pronounce it, it's correct.
Oh yeah, it is wild. And then not even the pronunciation, but also I'm drawing a blank on the website, but the etymology, like actually knowing what the names are, what they mean. So to drag this conversation out a little bit longer, like the paratilapia, para meaning on the side of or next to, and then
exactly.
And then tilapia is, I guess, just a name for an African native fish. And then the Tychromis, the the PTYX equals, that basically means fold, and then chromis is another way to say fish. So really breaking it down, because especially a lot of the African cichlids, like it's not just like a fun name, like a fun random word that they associated to this fish. A lot of times there's meaning in it, right? Like, the Greek name means that it is a fish eater or it is an egg eater, and that's actually kind of built into the genus or the species name.
No, it's true. There's a whole story about that. For example, I keep a Central American cichlid called Wypemheros nerisati. Now, what Sven Kullender's tried to do is he's trying to name the fish either genus or species according to the culture of the people that live in the area where that fish is found. And Waipam, from the Mayan dialect, means face in the mud. So a Wypemheros is literally a fish that buries its face in the mud, and that's what it does. It's the Central American equivalent of an earth eater, I guess you could say, from South America. So like Tawatin Suoya Makanzatsa, the Inca stonefish, that name is strictly made up of local cultural things, which is really a step in the right direction. Instead of calling something Bill Gates eye or whatever you want to call it, related to the culture of the area where it's found. And I'm all in favor of that.
No, I agree with you, Jim. Don't get me wrong, though. I do want a Randy Reed eye fish out there someday, though.
Yeah. Well, apparently I've got one. A former student of mine, eventually became a PhD ichthyologist, and he's a curator in one of the aquariums out west. And he was doing research on the ancient bony fishes in Manitoba. And there's one there that he has that he says he's going to describe someday, and it will be, my last name will be it, Cumming eye. So I'm waiting for the day.
That is super awesome. So that's why you have that attitude. You're like, yeah, I've already got one kind of in the bag, so every other one needs...
Hey, I'm okay. Nothing alive, though. This one's like 50 million years old. So.
Hey, I'll take one 100 million years old. It doesn't even... Good times.
You'll get your fish, dude. Don't worry.
All right, Jim. Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. This has been a fantastic conversation. I hope everybody out there has really enjoyed just hearing you. I mean, you've obviously got passion. You've got so much experience. And, I hope there's a day soon where I get a chance to meet you in person and hear you speak. I do have very, very minor influence in the speaker, the upcoming speakers for the Seattle Aquarium Society. So I'll try to see if I can throw some influence and have you come out to the Emerald City and speak to us.
Oh, I'd love to come out your way. That'd be great. And it'd be very nice to meet you, too.
Oh, absolutely. You'd be welcome here at my house, Jim. That's for certain.
Okay, Randy. Well, thank you very much, then.
All right, Jim. You have a wonderful day now.
You too. Bye.
Thank you again for listening to the Aquarist Podcast. As always, get involved in your local fish club, help grow this wonderful hobby, and have fun with other fish nerds.